The thick forest stood silent under the fading light of the evening sun. Tall trees swayed gently in the cool breeze, their shadows stretching long across the damp earth. Birds chirped softly, unaware of the cruel decision that had just been made. A black luxury car was parked at the edge of a narrow dirt path, its engine still humming as if hesitant to be part of what was about to happen. A man in an expensive tailored suit stepped out, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the moist ground. He had sharp features, cold eyes, and a restless impatience in his movements. His name was Raza Malik, a powerful businessman, a self-made millionaire, and a man who believed in control over everything in his life. Yet, at this moment, his hands trembled slightly as he opened the back door of the car. Inside, strapped into a small car seat, was a 3-year-old boy. His big, innocent eyes looked up at his father with confusion. He didn't understand why they had stopped in such a dark, lonely place. He didn't understand why his father's face looked so different today. Hard, distant, almost like a stranger. The boy's name was Zion, and he had been born with a disability that made it difficult for him to walk. His little legs were weak, and no matter how hard he tried, they never carried him as fast as other children his age. Raza sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He had built an empire from nothing, climbing his way to success with ruthless determination. He had never allowed weakness in his life. To him, everything was about power, reputation, and perfection. And now he had a son who was different. A son who would never be like other boys. A son who, in Raza's mind, was an embarrassment to his name. He had convinced himself that this was the right thing to do. The world was cruel to the weak, and Zion would never survive in it. It was better this way. No one would know. No one would question him. He had made sure of that. With a final deep breath, he unbuckled the boy's seatbelt and lifted him out of the car. Zion's tiny hands instinctively clutched onto his father's jacket. His trust so absolute, so unshaken. "Baba." His voice was soft, uncertain. Raza's jaw clenched. He couldn't let emotion weaken his resolve. Without answering, he walked deeper into the forest, carrying Zion in his arms. The trees loomed taller, their branches whispering secrets to the wind. Finally, he stopped near an old tree, its roots curling like outstretched fingers into the earth. The silence around them felt heavy, almost suffocating. Carefully, he set Zion down on the cold ground. The little boy wobbled, trying to balance himself, his weak legs struggling to support him. His tiny hands reached up toward his father again. "Baba, go home," he asked, his voice filled with innocent hope. Raza looked away. He couldn't meet his son's eyes. Without a word, he turned around and started walking back toward the car. The sound of small hands scraping against the earth followed him. A weak, desperate attempt to crawl. "Baba! Baba!" The cries grew louder, more panicked. But Raza kept walking. His face was stone, his heart locked away. Each step felt heavier, but he forced himself forward. The car door slammed shut. The engine roared back to life. And then, the millionaire drove away, leaving his son behind in the darkness of the forest. 30 years passed. And then, one day, Raza Malik's world was turned upside down. The city of Lahore had changed over the past 30 years. Skyscrapers now towered where small shops once stood. Roads stretched wider, and the rush of people never seemed to slow down. Life moved fast, but for Raza Malik, time had only made his world more silent. His once sharp features had softened with age. His hair now carried streaks of gray, but his presence still held power. He was still the same ruthless businessman, still feared, still respected. Yet, despite all his success, something had shifted in him over the years. An emptiness, a hollow space in his life that no amount of wealth could fill. It wasn't something he spoke about. It wasn't something he allowed himself to think about. But on certain nights, when the world outside was quiet, when he was alone in his grand mansion, he would hear it. The faint echo of a child's voice calling him, "Baba." It was never loud, never clear. Just a whisper from the past that refused to disappear. He told himself it didn't matter. He had moved on. The decision he made that day in the forest was for the best. The boy wouldn't have survived anyway. It was an impossible life, a life of struggle and pain. He had freed himself. He had freed them both. But fate has a strange way of bringing back the things we try to forget. One morning, as Raza sat in his office, scanning through business reports, his assistant walked in. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." Raza didn't look up. "I don't have time for unannounced meetings." "He insists it's important," the assistant hesitated. "And he brought something with him." Raza frowned, irritated. "Who is it?" The assistant shifted uncomfortably. "He didn't give his full name. Just said you would want to hear what he has to say." Raza sighed, setting his papers down. "Fine. Send him in." The door opened and a man walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with quiet confidence. His clothes were simple, nothing like the businessmen Raza usually dealt with. But there was something in his eyes, something sharp, observant, as if he was studying Raza just as much as Raza was studying him. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, the man reached into the small bag he carried and pulled out something wrapped in old cloth. He placed it carefully on Raza's desk and unwrapped it. Raza's breath caught in his throat. It was a small wooden toy. A simple, carved figure of a boy holding a tiny wooden cane. It looked worn, the edges smoothed from years of touch. But Raza knew exactly what it was. He had seen it before. Lifetime ago. His fingers twitched slightly as he reached out, touching the wooden surface. His heart pounded, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years rising in his chest, something dangerously close to fear. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice controlled but tight. The man smiled slightly, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that held secrets. "From someone who remembers you." Raza swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The man leaned forward just slightly. "A messenger," he said. "Sent by someone you left behind." Raza's chest tightened. He forced himself to remain calm, to keep his expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man chuckled softly. "You do." Silence stretched between them. Outside, the sounds of the city carried on as if nothing had changed. But inside the office, the air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Raza's fingers curled into a fist. "If this is some kind of game, I don't have time for it." The man tilted his head. "It's not a game, Mr. Malik. It's a reunion." A cold shiver ran down Raza's spine. The man stood up, picking up his bag. "He's waiting for you." Raza's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Before he could say anything else, the man turned and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused. "You have 30 years of answers to give. Don't be late." Then he was gone. Raza sat frozen in his chair, staring at the wooden toy on his desk. His hands felt clammy, his breathing uneven. 4 years. He had buried that day in the forest deep inside himself, locking it away where no one could touch it. But now it had come back. And it wasn't done with him yet. The wooden toy sat on Raza's desk, unmoving, yet it felt like it was staring back at him, demanding answers he wasn't ready to give. His fingers hovered over it, but he couldn't bring himself to pick it up again. His mind kept racing with questions. Who was that man? How had he found this toy? And most importantly, who was waiting for him? For the first time in years, Raza Malik felt something dangerously close to fear. Not the fear of losing money or power, but something deeper, something personal. He had spent his entire life making decisions that benefited him, cutting off anything that threatened his perfect world. He had convinced himself that the past was buried, forgotten. But the past never truly disappears. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay in his massive empty bedroom, staring at the ceiling, his mind trapped in memories he had long silenced. He could almost hear it again, the soft, uncertain voice of a little boy. "Baba, go home." The memory clawed at him, refusing to fade. By morning he had made a decision. He needed to find out who was behind this. And he needed to do it fast. He made a few calls, sending his most trusted men to dig into the stranger's identity. But the results were unexpected. The man had left no trace behind. No name, no background, nothing. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere, delivered his message, and vanished. That only made Raza more uneasy. Hours later, his phone buzzed with a message. "Come to the old factory near the railway station. Loan." Raza clenched his jaw. He didn't like being summoned like this. He was used to controlling situations, not being pulled into someone else's game. But something about this felt different. Felt personal. By nightfall, he found himself driving through the dimly lit streets toward the abandoned factory. The building stood like a forgotten relic, its rusted metal doors barely holding together, the windows broken and covered in dust. The air smelled of old oil and damp concrete. Stepping inside, Raza's footsteps echoed across the empty space. The dim light of a single hanging bulb flickered as he moved forward. Then he saw him. A figure sat in the shadows, his back turned, hands resting calmly on his knees. "You're late," the man said, his voice steady, controlled. Raza narrowed his eyes. "You don't get to summon me like this. Who are you?" The man slowly turned his head. The moment their eyes met, Raza felt something shift in the air. The man's face was sharp yet familiar. There was strength in his posture, but also something else, something that made Raza's heart pound in a way he hadn't felt in years. The man stood up, taking a slow step forward. His movements were precise, careful. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He held it up under the flickering light. Another wooden toy. This one was different. It was carved in the shape of a man, standing tall, with a tiny crack running down its side. The craftsmanship was delicate, but there was no mistaking what it was. A shiver ran through Raza's spine. The man's lips curled into a small, unreadable smile. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Raza's throat felt dry. He couldn't speak. He didn't want to say the name that was forming in his mind. The man took another step closer. "It's been a long time, Baba." The word sent a jolt through Raza's chest. He felt like the ground beneath him had vanished. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. The little boy he had left in the forest, the boy who could barely walk, the boy he had convinced himself wouldn't survive, was standing in front of him, strong, alive, and looking straight into his eyes. 1,000 questions crashed into Raza's mind at once. How had he survived? Who had found him? Where had he been all these years? And most importantly, why had he come back now? Before he could ask, the man, Zion, spoke first. His voice was calm, but there was something buried underneath, something cold. "I wonder if you ever thought about me," Zion said, tilting his head slightly. "Or if you just erased me from your life." Raza forced himself to stay composed. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Zion let out a quiet chuckle. "Oh, I think I do. You left me in that forest like I was nothing. You walked away. You drove off, thinking I wouldn't survive." He stepped even closer, his eyes locking onto Raza's. "But I did." Raza swallowed hard. His mind was spinning, but he refused to show weakness. "What do you want?" Zion studied him for a moment, then leaned in just slightly. "The truth." Raza forced a smirk. "You think you know the truth. You think you understand the choices I had to make." Zion's expression darkened. "I don't need to understand your choices. I lived through them." The silence between them stretched, thick with everything unsaid. Then Zion reached into his coat pocket again. This time he pulled out something that made Raza freeze. Photograph. Raza's breath hitched as he stared at it. It was old, slightly faded, but the image was clear. Woman. And beside her, Raza's hands clenched into fists. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Zion's lips curled into a knowing smirk. There's a lot you don't know, Baba. The air between them was charged, an unspoken storm waiting to break. And Raza knew in that moment that his past had finally caught up with him. Raza's fingers twitched as he reached for the photograph, but Zion didn't let go immediately. Their eyes met, a silent battle playing out between them. When Zion finally released it, Raza turned the photo toward the dim light, his breath catching in his throat. The woman in the picture had kind eyes, a soft face marked by time but still familiar. Her hair, though streaked with gray, was neatly pulled back. She stood with quiet strength, as if life had shaped her into someone unbreakable. And beside her was another man, older, with a deep scar running along his jaw. There was something unsettling about him, something in the way he stood. His gaze sharp even in the stillness of the image. Raza felt a strange weight pressing against his chest. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice low, careful. Zion didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, as if deciding how much to reveal. "She is the woman who saved me," he finally said. "The one who picked me up from the ground when you left me to die." His jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. "And the man next to her? He's the one who taught me how to survive." Raza swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had convinced himself that Zion wouldn't make it past that night, that he would fade away like a forgotten dream. But now, standing before him, was proof that the past had not just survived, it had grown stronger. Zion took a step closer. "Do you want to know how I lived, Baba?" His voice was laced with something sharp, something almost taunting. "Do you want to know what it's like to be abandoned in the middle of nowhere, with no one to call for help? Do you want to know what it feels like to crawl through the dirt, to feel the cold sink into your bones while you wait for someone who never comes back?" His voice didn't rise, but the intensity of his words filled the air like a storm about to break. Raza exhaled slowly, trying to keep control of the conversation. "I made a decision," he said, his voice even. "One that had to be made." Zion let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "That's what you tell yourself, isn't it? That you did what was necessary." He shook his head. "But tell me, did you ever wonder? Did you ever think about what happened after you drove away?" Raza forced himself to meet his son's gaze. "How did you survive?" he asked, the words feeling heavier than he expected. Zion studied him for a moment before answering. "I don't remember much from that night. I remember the cold. I remember the hunger. I remember crying until my voice stopped working." His hands curled into fists. "And then, when I couldn't move anymore, when I thought it was over, she found me. She wrapped me in a blanket. She carried me home. And for the first time in my life, someone looked at me and didn't see weakness." Raza felt something twist deep inside him, something he couldn't name. Zion's voice softened, but it lost none of its sharpness. "She wasn't rich. She wasn't powerful. But she had more kindness in her hands than you had in your entire life." He let the words sink in before continuing. "She took me in, raised me, gave me a new name. And for years I lived believing I was hers." Raza's jaw tightened. "Then why come back?" Zion tilted his head, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Because the past doesn't stay buried, Baba. No matter how much you try." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, pressing down on both of them. Then Zion's expression shifted, his eyes darkening. "But there's something you don't understand," he said, his voice quieter now, almost dangerous. "I didn't come back just to talk. I came back because someone else is looking for you." Raza's breath hitched. "Who?" Zion slid his hands into his pockets, watching Raza carefully. "The man in the photo." Raza felt the weight in his chest grow heavier. He knows who you are, Zion continued. He knows what you did. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. And he's been waiting for this moment for a long time. Raza's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He had spent decades controlling his world, ensuring that nothing and no one could threaten him. But now, standing in this abandoned factory, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. Zion took another step back, giving Raza one last look. You should prepare yourself, he said, his voice low. Because this is far from over. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Raza alone in the cold, empty space, the photograph still clutched tightly in his hands. Raza stood frozen in the abandoned factory, gripping the photograph as if it were the only thing holding him upright. The air around him felt heavier, thick with something he couldn't explain. He had spent his entire life believing that the past was dead, buried under layers of money, power, and time. But now it was clawing its way back, piece by piece. The man in the photograph. The one Zion had spoken about. Who was he? And why was he looking for him? Raza exhaled sharply and turned on his heel, his mind racing as he stepped out into the night. The streets were quieter now, but he could still hear the distant hum of traffic, the occasional burst of laughter from unseen figures. Life was moving on, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. As he reached his car, his phone buzzed. A blocked number. He hesitated before answering. Mr. Malik. The voice was deep, calm, controlled. But there was something unsettling about it, something familiar yet distant. Raza tightened his grip on the phone. Who is this? The man on the other end let out a slow chuckle. You don't remember me, do you? Raza's pulse quickened. He didn't like this. He didn't like being the one caught off guard. If you have something to say, say it. The man's tone didn't change. Oh, I have a lot to say. But first I need to know something. How does it feel? Raza frowned. How does what feel? To be the one waiting, the man said. To not know what's coming next. To not be in control for once. A chill ran down Raza's spine. He had spent his entire life making sure he was always the one pulling the strings. But now the roles were shifting. The man continued, his voice unhurried. I've been watching you for a long time, Mr. Malik. And now, finally, we get to talk. Raza forced his voice to remain steady. What do you want? Another chuckle. That's the wrong question. The real question is, what do you remember? The line went dead. Raza lowered the phone slowly, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. His mind was already working, trying to piece together the fragments of his past. There had been many men over the years, many enemies, many people he had left behind without a second thought. But this felt different. This wasn't just about business. This was personal. As he slid into the driver's seat, he caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, he saw something he wasn't used to seeing in himself. The next morning, Raza sat in his office, staring at the city skyline, deep in thought. His assistant entered cautiously. Sir, there's something you should see. She placed a small envelope on his desk. No name, no sender. Just a simple, unmarked envelope. Raza hesitated for a brief moment before opening it. Inside was a single piece of paper. She still remembers you. Raza's fingers tightened around the note. His mind instantly went to the woman in the photograph. The one who had raised Zion, the one who had saved him. Could it be her? Had she sent this? But before he could think further, his office door swung open. A man barged in, breathless, eyes wide with urgency. Sir, we have a problem, he said, his voice low. Raza glanced up, his face unreadable. What problem? The man hesitated, as if unsure how to say it. Then finally he took a step closer and lowered his voice. It's about your old house. The one outside the city. Raza stiffened. That house had been abandoned for years, left to decay along with the memories he refused to revisit. What about it? He asked. The man hesitated before answering. Someone's been there. And they left something behind. Raza's jaw tightened. Show me. Minutes later, Raza was in his car, speeding down roads he hadn't driven in decades. The house was far from the city, hidden between overgrown trees and forgotten roads. He hadn't set foot there in years. Not since. He forced the thought away. When he finally arrived, the sight of the house sent a strange sensation through him. It looked the same. Dust-covered windows, rusted gate, walls cracked from time. But something felt different. Something was different. His man led him inside. The air was thick with dust and time, the furniture untouched, the silence deafening. But then, in the middle of the old wooden floor, he saw it. Another envelope. Raza bent down, his fingers brushing against the aged paper. Slowly he opened it. Inside was another photograph. But this time it wasn't the woman. It was a picture of him, taken years ago, decades ago, from a time he had long since buried. His blood ran cold. And beneath the photograph, written in sharp, precise letters, was a message that made his hands tremble for the first time in years. You should have come back for me. The past wasn't just knocking at his door. It had already stepped inside. Raza's grip on the photograph tightened as his breath came in slow, measured exhales. The house around him felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air thick with something heavier than dust. The message on the back of the photograph echoed in his mind. You should have come back for me. The words carried weight. Something personal, something he wasn't ready to face. But before he could fully process it, the silence of the house was broken by the creak of a floorboard. Someone else was here. Raza's pulse quickened, but he didn't turn immediately. Instead, he straightened, slipping the photograph into his pocket. His years of experience teaching him to move carefully, to reveal nothing. You took your time, a voice said from behind him. Raza turned slowly. Standing in the doorway was a man he hadn't seen in decades. The same deep scar along the jaw, the same sharp eyes. The man from the photograph Zion had shown him. But now, seeing him in person, Raza felt something else. Recognition. The man tilted his head slightly, watching him. I wondered if you'd remember me, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. It's been a long time, hasn't it? Raza's lips pressed into a thin line. Who are you? The man let out a slow breath, shaking his head. That's disappointing, he murmured. But not surprising. Raza took a step forward. What do you want? The man chuckled. What do I want? He repeated the question as if it amused him. Then his expression darkened. I want what you stole from me. Raza frowned, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the room. Baba. Raza turned sharply. Zion stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something cold, something final. The scarred man smiled slightly. He doesn't remember, does he? He said to Zion, his tone almost pitying. Zion exhaled, then turned his full attention to Raza. I spent years trying to understand why you left me, he said, his voice eerily calm. And then, when I finally stopped asking that question, I started asking a different one. He took a step forward. Who were you trying to protect? Raza's stomach twisted. Zion pulled out another photograph and tossed it onto the old wooden table. It was old, edges frayed, but the image was clear. A woman, young, holding a baby in her arms. And next to her a man. The same man standing in front of Raza now. Raza's breath caught. He knew this picture. He had seen it before, years ago before everything fell apart. The scarred man watched him carefully. It's starting to come back, isn't it? He said. You didn't just abandon a child that night, Raza. You buried a secret. Raza swallowed, his mind racing. You weren't trying to get rid of Zion because he was weak, Zion continued. You were trying to save him. The room felt like it was closing in. Raza's voice was quieter now, rough. You don't understand. Zion tilted his head. Then make me understand. The scarred man stepped closer, his presence heavy with unspoken history. "Tell him, Raza," he said. "Tell him why you took him from me." Silence. For the first time in years, Raza felt truly unprepared. But the past had finally caught up with him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse. "Because I had no choice." The scarred man's expression flickered with something. Rage, grief, something in between. Raza turned to Zion, his gaze steady. "Your mother was in danger," he said. "She was running from something, someone. And I helped her disappear." He hesitated. "She gave you to me." Zion's body tensed. "That's a lie." Raza's jaw tightened. "No," he said. "It's the truth." Zion looked between the two men, confusion and anger warring on his face. "Then why did you leave me?" Raza exhaled slowly. "Because I thought it was the only way to keep you safe." The scarred man, Zion's real father, let out a quiet breath. "And yet, here we are." Silence stretched between them, heavy with years of pain, unanswered questions, and choices that could never be undone. Raza knew there was no way to fix what had been broken. But standing here, in the house that had held so many ghosts, he realized something. The past would never stay buried. Zion studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The scarred man lingered a moment longer, watching Raza. Then he gave a small nod, whether of understanding or warning, Raza couldn't tell, and followed his son into the night. And just like that they were gone. Raza stood alone in the house, the weight of everything settling onto his shoulders. For the first time in his life he had no control. And maybe that was his real punishment. Raza stood in the quiet of the abandoned house, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The silence felt heavier now, like the house itself was holding on to all the things left unsaid. For years, he had convinced himself that the past was nothing more than a closed door, one that he had locked and thrown away the key to. But now he knew better. The past never really stayed behind. It only waited for the right moment to return. His fingers brushed over the old photograph in his pocket, the edges rough and worn from time. He thought of Zion's face, the way his voice had hardened with betrayal and confusion. The truth should have set him free. Instead, it had only deepened the distance between them. With a slow breath, Raza turned and walked out of the house. The night air was cool against his skin, the city lights faint in the distance. His driver waited by the car, silent as always, but something about the man's posture told Raza that even he sensed the shift in the air. Raza slid into the back seat, closing the door behind him. "Home," he said, though the word felt strange on his tongue. What even was home anymore? A mansion filled with expensive things, empty of real warmth. A life built on foundations that had now begun to crack. The car pulled onto the road, and as the house disappeared from view, so did the last remnants of the life he had once tried so hard to forget. The following days passed in a blur. Raza returned to his work, meetings and deals that once commanded his full attention now feeling distant, hollow. His empire remained intact, but for the first time, he wondered if it had ever truly belonged to him. Power, wealth, status. They had shielded him from many things, but not from himself. Not from the questions that now haunted his mind. Late one evening, as he sat alone in his office, his phone buzzed. The number was unlisted, but he already knew who it was. He answered without a greeting. "You should have told me everything from the beginning." Zion's voice came through, quieter than before. Raza closed his eyes briefly. "Would you have believed me?" "Was. Then maybe not. But at least I wouldn't have spent my whole life hating you." Raza leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I never wanted you to hate me." Zion's voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. A sadness, a disappointment that Raza didn't know how to fix. "You made that impossible." Raza stayed silent, allowing the weight of those words to settle between them. There were no easy answers, no perfect endings. He had thought he was protecting Zion all those years ago. But now, he wasn't sure if he had only stolen something from him instead. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Zion admitted after a long pause. Raza nodded to himself. "I don't expect you to." Another silence. Then, softer this time, Zion said, "But I don't think I can keep hating you either." Something in Raza's chest tightened. Zion cleared his throat. "I need time. To understand everything. To figure out who I am outside of all this." Raza swallowed, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. "Take all the time you need." There was no goodbye, only the quiet click of the call ending. But for the first time in a long time, Raza didn't feel completely alone. Days turned into weeks. Raza stayed out of Zion's way, knowing the younger man needed space to untangle the truth from the life he had built for himself. There were no more unexpected messages, no more photographs arriving in the dark. One evening, as Raza stood by the large window of his mansion, looking out over the city that had once been his entire world, he felt something shift inside him. The ghosts of his past would never fully disappear, but maybe that was okay. Maybe he wasn't meant to erase them, only to learn how to live with them. And as the city lights flickered below, Raza realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't running from the past anymore. He was finally standing still, facing it. And that, in itself, was its own kind of freedom.